Many Christians have been rocked in the last week by a report from Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. The ministry says that it has found claims of sex abuse by the late Zacharias to be true. It has apologized to his victims and pledged to reform the ministry. Attorney Boz Chividjian is a longtime advocate for sex abuse survivors, and he joins us now with more. Boz, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Heather. Good to be here.
I appreciate it. A lot of people do seem to be talking about this case. You have watched so many cases similar to this unfold over the years, but I'm wondering, do you think that this particular one is getting more attention than previous ones in the Christian world?
Well, Heather, I wish all of them would get attention. This one should have had attention back in 2016, 2017, when it first surfaced. Ravi and others around him were successful in largely keeping it quiet. I was an attorney that was representing one of the victims in this matter. And I think I'm glad to hear, at least now, years later, even though it's too late, in my opinion, in many ways, that it's finally coming to the surface. I mean, God is in the business of bringing darkness to light. And sometimes we want that light to come sooner than it does. But I'm glad it does, because that's when I think true healing, especially in the lives of those who've been so hurt by him and this organization, can continue on their road to healing in a much more hopeful way.
Right. I want to ask you about where things stand now and where they might go going forward. The RZIM board has apologized for not holding Zacharias accountable and for not believing his victims, and it's pledged to care for them and move forward with organizational reform. What are your thoughts on these steps?
I mean, I think those are good words. I always say in these types of situations, and that's not just limited to RZIM, let's wait to see what happens. Let's wait to see the action points. Let's wait to see what happens when the spotlight is no longer on the organization. Are they still as committed and determined to do the things that they're telling us now? I'm hopeful that they are, but there's a lot of work to do. And, I had a friend of mine recently tell me, she said, sometimes restoration requires destruction when the problems are systemic. And so I would also say that it should be a consideration for the organization as to whether or not they continue. Maybe they take the time and the resources that they have currently and put those towards helping and identifying and serving those who've been so decimated by the man who the ministry was named after.
Right. And can you talk just a little bit, Boz, about spiritual abuse? Because what was happening here was not just sexual abuse, but it was a person in spiritual authority also having spiritual conversations around this abuse with his victims, as I understand it.
Yeah, that is so destructive in so many ways. What a lot of people don't realize is when somebody in a spiritual position, in a spiritual leadership position, takes that position, exploits that position to gain the trust of vulnerable people, in gaining their trust, they will hear a lot about those individuals' lives and about their weaknesses, about their struggles, and then they gain that trust and admiration and then turn around and use it against that person. And oftentimes that person who's opened up to the spiritual leader would never dream about saying anything to anybody because of the fear about all the things that they have shared with this leader coming forward. And add on to that the fact that oftentimes these leaders are seen as representatives of God. And so how confusing is it for somebody to be groomed and abused by somebody in that type of position and then to try to even remotely have a relationship with God? It's very destructive, and it takes years and years of intense therapy and God's goodness and grace to bring healing, spiritual healing, to those types of individuals.
You mentioned that you had a client involved in this RZIM case. How is that client doing now? What can you tell us about your client?
Yeah, well, Lori Ann Thompson is my client, and she and her husband are, I was just telling them this morning, they are the picture of God bringing beauty out of the ashes. I read in the report this past weekend where Ravi and a colleague would laugh and say, I wonder how long they're going to remain married, maybe 6 years. And the other person said, no, 3 months, or I'm paraphrasing. And here we are years later, and God has been good to them. They are married happily. They've been to hell and back, but God is truly in the business of bringing beauty out of the ashes. And so the best thing I can tell you about Lorianne and Brad Thompson are they're amazing people who have been to hell and back, but have also seen the work of God in their life when they had lost all hope.
I want to ask you, too, one detail, but it stood out to me. The board so far has remained anonymous. Do you think this will change?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I didn't even know that the RZIM board was anonymous until the last week or two. That's crazy. I mean, if you're going to live and speak about being transparent, you start with saying who is actually running this organization. You cannot hold people accountable and even begin to discuss accountability when there's no transparency, and that begins at the board.
All right, and I want to circle back on a point I mentioned earlier briefly, but do you think what is happening with RZIM will encourage other Christian organizations, faith-based groups, to perhaps take a closer look at how they run their organizations? Are you hearing anything like that at this point in time?
When these types of things surface, you do hear that. The question is it sustained? Or do we sort of, like I said earlier, once the spotlight dims, do we sort of move on to sort of the status quo? Heather, I think especially in America, Christian evangelical organizations and churches really need to take a step back and to really evaluate what part of us are reflecting the very Jesus that we proclaim. When we place leaders in positions where there's no accountability, and when the leader is almost the sole resource for bringing in funds and for bringing in notoriety to the organization, we are creating a mess, and it doesn't reflect the Jesus that I know. And I think it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of time within the American evangelical world to understand that, but more than understand that, to make the hard decisions to do something about that, so that we actually, as organizations and churches, can better reflect the character and person of Jesus, because right now, that's lacking.
A very sobering moment. Boz Tchividjian, attorney and victim advocate, thank you for your insights.
Thank you so much, Heather.